Dr. Neil Postman of New York University, why did you write the book, Amusing Ourselves to Death?
Because television is an awesome technology that has the capability of completely changing the culture. So I addressed myself to television not only in this book, but a couple of others I've done. I'm trying to explore how television is changing our culture in as many ways as I can. This particular book deals mostly with how television alters our views toward politics, religion, news, to some extent education. So I regard myself as a social critic of sorts, whose job is to call to people's attention problematic issues that arise in the culture, and television certainly is one.
Do you watch television?
I love television. I think it's particularly good in sports. I think that's its strong point. I try never to watch television when it's serious, because I always find that an embarrassment when people like Tom Brokaw or Walter Cronkite pretend that they're doing something serious. I'm always embarrassed by that and prefer to watch old movies and sports.
Why? Why?
Why do I prefer that?
No. Why do you think that Tom Brokaw and Walter Cronkite are pretending to do something serious?
Well, I'm embarrassed by it because C-SPAN aside, the function of television in America is to gather an audience, which can be sold to advertisers. That's its fundamental purpose. It should be pointed out that when radio first came on the scene, such conservative observers as Herbert Hoover, who was Secretary of Commerce when the Radio Act was first passed, didn't believe that it was possible that radio could be used for commercial purposes. He saw it as strictly an educational medium, and probably would have been horrified to see what has happened to radio and television. But by the time television came along, it was well established that this would be used as an instrument for the advancement of corporate profits. So what television is mostly in America is an attempt to gather an audience for any reason. In other words, in a way, television is quite unprecedented in that in the past, audiences were gathered for specific reasons, to hear speeches or even to see specific events. But television doesn't do that. Its job is to gather an audience, and it doesn't really much care what it uses as the means to gather an audience. Now, to get to the book, I discovered a couple of things. That American television knows that the best way to gather an audience is to provide something that is amusing. And it may be, Brian, we could get into this, that television may not be good for anything else. I mean, you'd probably want to quarrel with me on that, but insofar as we're talking about American commercial television, that's what its best is, to provide amusement in order to gather an audience. And so when Cronkite or Brokaw tried to do something serious, the first thing we know is that within 8 minutes, they're going to stop for a United Airlines commercial. Now, the point is, how serious can it be, whatever it is that they're saying, if after 8 minutes they're going to stop for United Airlines or Calvin Klein jeans? I mean, they could be, and of course the same thing is with our 6 o'clock and 11 o'clock news. How serious can a flood in Mexico be, or an earthquake in Japan, if it is preceded by a Calvin Klein's jeans commercial and followed by a yogurt commercial? I mean, that fact in itself so changes the content of what passes for news that I find it an embarrassment to the very idea of an informed public. So that's one of the. I mean, even when whichever network did the show on the Holocaust, I mean, thank God they didn't have a commercial for the Brooklyn Union Gas Company, you know, which is conceivable. And I think, by the way, once happened when the play Judgment at Nuremberg was done many years ago. But how can you do a drama about the Holocaust with Calvin Klein jeans commercials in there? That doesn't make it a drama about the Holocaust anymore. That makes it into something else. Now, just beyond that, it's perfectly obvious that people like Brokaw and Rather are there because they're attractive men. So that what passes for newscasters in America is something quite different from what we used to know as journalists. I mean, these are among the most gorgeous people in America. And they're there because they're charismatic and they're good looking and they have memorable faces. And we know that people largely watch the news because of the news teller, not so much the news. And in any case, the news would only be in 30-second fragments. So that when television does news, when it tries to do what Americans now call political debates, this cannot be taken seriously by an informed public. I mean, what is a debate? We have President Reagan and Vice President Mondale in front of the camera, and someone like Barbara Walters says, first question for you, Mr. President, is what do you think is the solution to the problem in the Middle East? You will have 2 minutes to answer, after which Vice President Mondale will have 60 seconds for rebuttal. Now, who can take that seriously? If Reagan and Mondale were serious men, in fact, they would turn to Miss Walters and say, what kind of men do you think we are? We're running for the highest office in the land. You can't answer a question like this in 2 minutes, nor can you rebut someone else's answer in 60 seconds. Or they might turn to Miss Walters and say, what kind of people do you think the American public is? That they will put up with a forum in which candidates for the presidency are asked to respond to a question like this in 2 minutes or 1 minute. But in fact, none of that ever happens. Reagan does answer, and Mondale does give his rebuttal, and everyone goes on with this charade that television is informing the public. In fact, television, I would argue, is not. It's amusing the public, and that this is not a legitimate form of political discourse, but is taken right from the values of show business.
What's the effect of this if you're right?
Well, there are lots of effects. One is that it may well be that although the American public knows of many things, it knows about very little. And Americans may be the most ill-informed people in the Western world. I did a survey a couple of years ago of what people knew about Iran. And I chose that subject because the Iranian hostage crisis had recently been completed, which means that for every day for over a year, the television news dealt with the Iranian hostage crisis. So if there was any subject you could expect the Americans to know something about, it would be Iran. And I asked several hundred people some simple questions, one of them being, where is Iran? What religion do the Iranians practice? Where did the Shah come from? What does Ayatollah mean? questions of this sort. I found out that most people knew nothing. Those who did, when asked, how do you know this, said, well, they read it in the New York Times, or Time magazine had done a story about this, and so on. Now, I concede that television is a window to the world, as all television executives like to say. But it's a curious kind of window with interesting distortions and refractions. It presents a fragmented world. I mean, this would be typical, wouldn't it, Brian, of something happening on the news. Say, the voiceover says, or the newscaster, as he's called, says, more shooting in Beirut today. Then we see some film of a street, perhaps in Beirut, a body on the floor. We hear shots. Maybe see a woman leaning over the body. This image is powerful. So people know of Beirut. They know there's shooting in Beirut. Do they know who's shooting at whom, or why, or what is the historical context for this? Television news doesn't speak to that because it's a visual medium. That's one reason. Language is not its strong point. It deals in fast-moving images. So the first thing the directors of news shows want to know is, do we have film footage? I mean, David Halberstam did an interesting piece in TV Guide about a year ago about the growth of the Japanese economy, that this story had been building for years. But Americans really didn't know about it, mostly because there were no visuals to show. So the television, for all practical purposes, ignored it. What could you show? Well, I guess you could show graphs, but TV directors don't like to show graphs. They like to show more exotic and interesting, dynamic images. So in the first place, television is interested mostly in gathering an audience, and it does it by keeping people amused. In the second place, it may even be that television is not a suitable medium for the communication of serious ideas. After all, an idea is sentences, language. And television is not terribly comfortable with language. Its strong suit is the visual image. Maybe in the end, that's what we should rely mostly on television for, and in fact, I suppose we do now.
Now, this book was originally written in 1985, published in hardback. This is now out in paperback. I guess, can you get it in most bookstores?
I hope so.
Did anybody react to this book in the first place strongly, negatively? You get letters from people in the business saying, how dare you?
No, because I mean, there was at least one quite hostile review in The Atlantic. Most of the reviews were pretty good, especially in the New York Times. But when I hear from television people, they're usually quite in agreement, because most people who are in television know that what I'm talking about is largely true. I mean, they understand that when you do news on television, what you have to do is do it in 30-second bites. I was on a Ted Koppel program, and I should say I regard him as one of the few men around who does try to bring some intellectual decorum to television. But he would be the first to concede that in his 30-minute Nightline program, he has got to follow the show business rules, which is, for example, you can't let someone talk the way I'm talking here, because this is just a talking head. And although Koppel's program is more talky than others, he always tries to have 2 or 3 guests if he can, so they can move to other people. And he doesn't want you talking too long, and he knows that every few minutes, whatever it is, maybe it's 8 minutes for him, he's got to stop for a commercial. So there's going to be discontinuity in the whole event. He struggles hard to overcome this sort of thing. But I'm quite sure that if he were here, he would agree that this is one of the problems of commercial television. I know that McNeil of McNeil Era has written things very similar to what I've said in this book. As a matter of fact, he got an award at New York University which required him to give a speech in which he said pretty much the same thing. Bill Moyers has been very interested in this book and has also talked about these issues. So when you think of the serious people who are somehow trying to master this medium, they understand that they're coming up against certain obstacles that make it difficult to use the medium, at least within the American context, for any other purpose than just gathering an audience.
Yeah. It's not enough time to go through all this book, and if we did, then people wouldn't have a reason to go out and buy it. One chapter that just caught my attention because it's something that I've noticed over the years. It's chapter 7 in the book, and later we can get a shot of it. The chapter heading is Now This. Explain what Now This is all about.
Well, I like to think that television newscasters have created a new grammatical category. See, now this is a special kind of conjunction. But whereas we were taught in school that conjunctions connect one thing with another, now this is a conjunction that disconnects one thing from another. So that when a newscaster says, and now this, he means that what you're about to see has no connection with what you have just been seeing, and that you must not be morbidly preoccupied with what you've just been seeing, and you must now pay attention to a commercial. Now, I think this Now This phenomenon is terrifically important from a psychological point of view. For instance, what sort of person is sitting at home who is addressed in the following way? The newscaster says, there was an earthquake in Mexico City. We're going to show you pictures. And 100,000 people are believed to be dead. Goes on. Now this. And now the Calvin Klein jeans commercial is on. Well, now let's just think of what is required of the audience now. Ought the audience to be saying, now wait a second, I can't think about a Calvin Klein jeans commercial. We're talking about 100,000 people buried, possibly. Let's get back to this. Well, television doesn't want this, because if you linger too much on this story from Mexico City, then you can't pay attention to the commercial. So they've invented this curious piece of language. You say, now this, and that's a signal. It says, whatever concerns you had, whatever feelings might have been evoked by some of these dramatic images we've shown you, forget about it. Because now we want you to pay attention to this commercial. It's very strange.
Does it make you mad when you hear that?
Well, it used to, but of course one is used to that. And by the way, Brian, I've often thought what would happen in a book if this, for instance, when you were reading this book, if somewhere along about page 6, I said something like, now, before I go on, I'd like to say a word in behalf of Chase Manhattan Bank and then do a little promo for Chase Manhattan. Now, the thing is, what would happen is you'd probably throw the book away. I mean, you'd say, well, what in the hell is this guy doing? Or you'd say, what kind of fool does he take me for? If he wants to engage me in a serious argument, then he has to have continuity in tone and in content. He can't expect a serious reader to read along for 5 pages and then shift gears to think about Chase Manhattan Bank or Pan Am Airlines. You wouldn't accept this as a reader. And how people have got conditioned to accept this on television is one of the great psychic almost revolutions of the past couple of decades, that people do not get angry. They've just incorporated it. I mean, they've just accepted that discontinuity is a feature of this medium. And a television can tell me about anything, no matter how serious, grotesque, appalling. But I know that it will only go on for about 40 seconds. And I also know I have to be prepared to switch psychic gears so that I forget about that. It's very interesting. I mean, I don't pretend that I understand it all myself, but it's quite different from almost any other medium I could think of. I mean, in a movie, people wouldn't stand for it. Somehow, when you put a movie on television, however, people do accept it. Last night I was watching Inherit the Wind. In the middle, not in the middle of a scene, but in the middle of a sentence by Spencer Tracy, they just cut it and went to a commercial. And I was wondering, well, I mean, I know these things are computerized and maybe they just have it figured out, you know, every 6 minutes they go to commercial. But I suppose they were thinking, what difference does it make if we cut it here or if we cut it at some other point? The audience is conditioned to this sort of discontinuity, so it's no problem.
Do you have any suspicion that the home video cassette recorder might eventually grab a hold of people to the extent that it will really hurt television in general because of this very thing you're talking about? You get it in context?
I read an interesting quote by Federico Fellini the other day where he was talking about the remote control, the zapper. And he said that, just to begin there, and he said that the zapper makes each viewer his or her own director and exhibitor. And I have to think about that because obviously that changes the nature of the television experience. He also remarked that it creates a very impatient audience, that the viewer holding the zapper has had his or her what shall I call it, tolerance span reduced. I mean, there was a time if you had to get up from your seat that you would give something a little more time before you would change it. Now, you know, you can do it in a few seconds. Well, as for the videotape recorder, of course, that's changing everything. And
for the better? Or you think this is all bad? Is this all bad that we're talking about here?
I mean,
long-term civilization impact, those kind of things?
I don't really know. I mean, it's conceivable that it could change everything for the better. The most interesting fact that I know in the history of communications is this, that the printing press was invented in Germany with movable type in roughly the year 1450. It wasn't until the year 1516, almost 70 years later, that anyone thought of numbering the pages in books. Now you'd think that that's something they would have thought of immediately, but they didn't. It took that long before someone thought of it. I mention this because by numbering the pages in books, obviously you change the function of books. You can use them in ways that you can't use unnumbered books, unpaged books. This videotape recorder may be a comparable switch, that it changes the structure of network television, that it may be that, and here's where the better comes in, that since people would have available all the entertainment stuff they want on videotape, that eventually television will really make an attempt to become a serious form of public communication. I mean, that's conceivable. It's conceivable.
Let me ask you on that note about, you talk about the difficulty of keeping an audience. Why do you think, we may get more than we deserve out of this question, why do you think somebody would sit here and listen to you for a whole hour?
It's astounding to me. I don't think I would. Well, in the first place, I mean, there are people, perhaps a declining number, who are interested in language, in discourse, in ideas, and that they will turn to language because they find that stimulating. You see still a lot of this on European television, where you will have talking heads, some of the most brilliant people, poets, philosophers, scientists, just like this, saying wonderful words. And there are still audiences for this in Europe. One hopes that there are audiences for this in America. Now, you'd know more about this.
I'm hoping the same way you are.
You know,
we're in trouble.
Than I would. But this is something both of us have to worry about. You from the standpoint of your attempts to do something different with television. Mine from the standpoint of an educator. We both have to ask ourselves what's happening with language. Jacques Ellul, the well-known French sociologist, recently published a book with the title The Humiliation of the Word. And he makes the point, as others have, that one of the characteristics of the new media, television and VCR and even film and mass-produced photography and so on, is to humiliate the word. That is, the word moves to the periphery of the culture and the visual image takes its place at the center. Now, that is happening. How fast it's happening, whether or not anything can be done to slow the process down is another question. But I mean, there are people, obviously, I don't know if they'd listen to this kind of talk, but they'd listen to talk if it's good talk and if it stimulates their mind. But I don't know if you could get a mass audience. I mean, I write about in the book on this whole question of a political debate. I wanted to remind my fellow countrymen and women that if you look at the most famous example of political debate in American history, namely the Lincoln-Douglas debates, they should know that Lincoln and Douglas had many debates and throughout Illinois, And some of their debates lasted for 7 hours. Lincoln speaking for 3, Douglas for 3, and then Lincoln an hour of rebuttal. And then when they moved to the next town, the other way around. Can you imagine an American audience listening to 7 hours of talk today? I doubt it. And if you look at some of the transcriptions of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, it doesn't even seem possible to me that an American audience today could understand the language. The syntax is fairly complex. The references require a great deal of now. I mean, my guess is, Brian, that the electorate in America today, if it heard the Gettysburg Address for the first time, would not be able to understand most of it, if for no other reason than that the syntax is too complex. So one does worry about the fact that language as a means of public communication has become increasingly less important, if that shows my own disabilities in language, but has diminished in its power. President Reagan is a perfect example. Here is a man who is referred to as the great communicator, yet he rarely speaks accurately and never precisely. Yet he's called the great communicator, and probably with good reason. In the 1860s, he would have been unthinkable because he can't talk. But you put him on television and he's dynamite, because people see, let's put it this way, talk about politics for a minute. Politicians, there are two kinds of information in political discourse. What Irving Goffman used to call information you give and information you give off. Now, by information you give, he means words, reasons, explanations, facts, conclusions, language. By information you give off, he means all the nonverbal information that the image gives. Now, the ratio has been changed. Prior to television, people concentrated mostly on the information the politicians gave, their language. After television, they concentrate on the information that politicians give off. So if Bruce Babbitt has pop eyes, or if Paul Simon looks like a maitre d' in a second-class restaurant, or if George Bush looks like more like an ex-Tiddlywinks player than an ex-first baseman, this cuts very deep into the consciousness of the public. This is why they all have image managers. I mean, Bush is a very interesting case, because everyone says you put him on television and he looks like a wimp. Now, actually, if there's anyone in this campaign who has better macho credentials than George Bush, I don't know who it would be. I mean, I think he was the youngest Navy airline pilot in World War II. He was head of the CIA. He was a first baseman on the Yale baseball team. I mean, this guy should be like Rambo. You put him on television, and what he gives off is altogether different. So he has to work on what? Not his discourse, not his ideas, but somehow giving off different things from what he gives off.
Let me ask you, jump in and ask you about the Lincoln-Douglas debates. How many people actually sat there for 7 hours?
Well, almost everybody who went. I mean, these
But
were...
how many people was that? Were that
Well,
used to attend? Do you have any
they
idea?
went all, you know, I think they started them, the 7 debates that we always call the Lincoln-Douglas debates didn't last 7 hours. I think those were 3, although the 2 of them debated many times before that. And there were several hundred people at each place they went. They went to, I think they started in Ottawa, Illinois, and then they went around. And of course, rhetoric, public debate, language in the middle of the 19th century was very much part of the social life and also the intellectual life of the people. I mean, they loved debate, they loved rhetoric, and they got, I mean, going on the stump, as they called it, was quite common throughout America. And of course, writers, Mark Twain especially, made small fortunes giving talks. Now, I'm not pining for those days. I just mention that so that one can get some sense of what a medium like television does. It changes the ratio of communication means.
Okay, let me stop you there and ask you about a little bit about yourself. You teach. Do you teach? You actually have students?
Mm-hmm. Sure, real live students.
Real live students. How many?
Mostly graduate students.
What?
Although I have recently been teaching undergraduates.
How long have you taught?
Well, I've been at NYU for 27 years.
So and that's 27 years of television. I mean, there've been television around during those 27
That's
years.
right.
Have you noticed a change in your students over the 27 years?
Oh, absolutely. And I would say most teachers who've been around this long will give you the same.
Give us some.
Well, one of the things that worries all of us, of course, is writing skills. And here's an interesting thing about this. One of the fundamental ideas in language and in reasoning is that you must try to avoid a contradiction. All reasonable people are suspicious of contradiction and keenly alert to contradictions in people's discourse. Now, I've discovered that sensitivity to contradiction in the writing of my students has eroded. I'll give you an example, and I mentioned one in the book. This would be typical, saying to a student, now look, John, in the first paragraph, you say such and such is true. But in this third paragraph, you say the opposite is true. Now, that's a contradiction. Which is it going to be? And John says, no problem. I say, yes, problem. He says, no problem. Because I said this is true here, and now I say this is true here. Now, I don't know how to explain to such a student what the problem is. If a student does not really have a well-developed concept of what a contradiction is, it's very hard to explain it. And I've talked about this to many teachers, and they've said, yes, they've noticed this, especially in the writing of their students. And we've speculated on why this could be. And I think I have an answer, although I may be wrong on this. See, writing is a very linear process. That's very sort of logical. You know, you go down the list. Television and film as well have different structures. I mean, you can look, there's a picture, it's on for 30 seconds, and here's another picture. And then here's a third picture, and here's a fourth picture. There's a kind of, there is no logical structure to the images that you see in the media. And this may have something to do with this erosion of a notion of contradiction. Print people, like myself, for example, people who make their living with words, are very sensitive to contradiction and have trained ourselves to ferret out contradiction. And when someone is speaking to us, we can almost see the words on the page. And we say things like, let's go back to what you said 2 or 3 sentences ago. That seems to contradict what you say. When you say, let's go back, it's almost as if you're looking at the page. Well, the kids born just 25 years ago, I don't think have this kind of sensitivity to language or notions about it. So that's one thing that I've noticed and many others have noticed.
What about an interest? I mean, as television had an impact on what their interests are? You've got the book that
Cultural literacy.
What I was thinking of
Bloom's book.
Bloom's, yeah. Bloom's
Well,
book.
cultural literacy is even a better example. I don't know if you know that book by E.D. Hirsch Jr. It's usually paired with Alan Bloom's book, but he's the guy who, Hirsch is, who had an appendix in the back of his book of, I don't know, 1,500 names, places, events, aphorisms that he thought an educated person should know. And many people have been appalled at how little the youngsters know about these things. And in a way, it is terrifying to have to make a reference to Hitler or Churchill or even Roosevelt and see kind of look on the students' faces that says, you better tell us who these people are. I mean, there is something terrifying about this. But to enlarge the scope of this discussion, I'm not blaming the youngsters for this. We do have what might be called an information crisis, especially in America, because we're the only culture in the world that really is living with 20th century technology. And this is the crisis. Up until very recently in human history, people suffered from a scarcity of information. And one of the functions of school was to provide them with solid, reliable, important information that the students could not get outside the classroom walls. Now we have, for the first time, the opposite problem. Not information scarcity, but information satiation. If you look at Hirsch's list of what he thinks the average American should know, he's got Babe Ruth, but he doesn't have Hank Aaron. He's got Austin, Texas, but he doesn't have Trenton, New Jersey. He's got the Beatles, but I don't think he's got Rodgers and Hammerstein. So you look at the list and say, well, this is almost completely arbitrary. I could make up a list of another 1,500 things that he doesn't have. Why these 1,500 things? So the point is this: the kids know thousands of things that I don't know, and I know thousands of things that they don't know. Now, what should I do? Well, I can make them know the things that I know. But somehow that doesn't seem to me the answer, because there are still thousands of other things that they should know about that I don't know, and you see the problem. And of course, the computer technology just compounds this. We have a situation where people are dying, not from lack of information, but from too much information, because they've got this new problem of what information is relevant for them to know.
Let me ask you about politics, because that's really what this network is devoted to. You've got a chapter, Reach Out and Elect Someone. You wrote that in 1985. And you also have a chapter right before that called Shuffle Off to Bethlehem, which seems to me to recognize the televangelists long before the trouble they had in 1987. Combining the two of them because you have Pat Robertson running. What's going to be different in 1988 because of television than, say, 20 years ago? Or even 8 years ago?
The problem is amplified now. It's become more serious. 8 years ago, it was serious enough so that Americans actually elected a former Hollywood movie actor as president.
What kind of marks do you give him, though, even though he was an actor? Are you, at this stage in the game, how would you rate the current presidents?
Well, you mean the current candidates, or?
No, the current president, President Ronald Reagan. What marks do you give him after?
Well, I would, of course, I didn't vote for him and wouldn't, and I don't want my, my own political preferences to get in the way of this point, because if the Democrats could have figured out, I mean, if they could have run Henry Fonda, and Fonda could have beaten Reagan, I mean, or come close, they would have done that just as well. Same time, I don't want to avoid your question. Just generally, I think the history of the American presidency, if you start with, Washington and go through to Reagan, refutes Darwin all by itself. But I find Reagan, myself, appalling. That at this stage in our history, that we would have chosen someone who was so ill-informed and so inarticulate.
You blame that on television?
Television produces this. And Brian, we may get Gary Hart. We may get Gary Hart because he is an attractive figure on television. And when he goes to work with television, armed with his hair blower and his youth and a certain sort of residual kind of reminiscence of John F. Kennedy, which he works over pretty well, people may say that's what we want because he gives off something. Not that he gives, but he gives off something that draws. I had an uncle who voted for Reagan. I mention this because he was all his life a solid Democrat, man of about 80 years old at the time, and he voted for Reagan. And I asked him why he voted for Reagan. This was in Reagan's competition against Mondale, and this is what he said to me. He said, because if I invite Ronald Reagan to my house and took him in the kitchen and gave him a glass of tea and a cracker and told him my problems, he would understand. But if I asked Mondale to come in, Mondale wouldn't know what the hell I'm talking about. And I said, well, where did you get this idea? And he said, turn on the television and look at them. So no one is, in quotes, blaming television. Television is the fundamental point about television is that it is not a medium for the distribution of news, but it is a new conception of how to represent politics to people. So it's a new instrumentality which has new conceptions of what a debate is, new conceptions of what political discourse is, new conceptions of what political stature. Reagan is, I think Kennedy was our first television president, but Reagan is our first great image president. What is terrific about Reagan on television is that when you look at Reagan, you can project onto Reagan what you think a president should be. See, Kennedy was very much identifiable as a Bostonian, and Carter very much as a Southerner. I think television in the long run works against that strong identification, which I think is going to give Cuomo a problem. Dole would be very good, except he gives off this tremendous sense of repressed hostility. And he can't, there's nothing he can do about it. I mean, his image guys are going to work on it. But this is going to be devastating to him. What he gives off is repressed hostility, and people turn away from that. What Reagan gave off was, in a sense, nothing. So Reagan gives off, whatever you want, I am. And I think some of the real savvy image managers know this better than I do. And they're going to work on that. See, I mean, if Cuomo is too much the ethnic, the New York, Italian guy, street smart, what he gives, I find very congenial. I mean, my political position is what he gives, I like. But we're not talking about that. And on television, that's relatively unimportant. By the way, I mean, just one little fact about this. I think all through President Reagan's tenure as president, the polls more or less consistently showed that the majority of Americans did not agree with most of his policies, but they loved him. So the old idea of politics, do I agree with this man or disagree with him, becomes repressed. The question now is, do I like him or do I not like him? And so there's a new kind of politics now. And I'm sure, as I said, that most of the image people who work with these guys, I mean, Geraldine Ferraro gave off something over which she has no control, just as I have no control over what I'm giving off now. And
by the way, do you have any idea what you're giving off?
Well,
I mean, you know yourself. I mean, what do you think? What's the worst thing somebody's out there saying about you right now?
Well, some people are probably saying, this guy claims to know more than he really does. Probably because when you get in front of television, you know, you're apt to talk when the guy asks you questions. Wouldn't it be great if I could say to some of your questions, you know, let's think about this, Brian. Then the two of us would just sit there. Here's the problem. The problem is thinking is not a performing art. And television requires a performing art. So we almost never see anyone thinking. By the way, every once in a while when I watch the Buckley show, what is it, The Open, no, Firing Line, or Dick Hefner's show, The Open Mind, you will see people actually thinking, which is why they're never on prime time. But most of the time you can't see people thinking because you have to do something, perform. Now, I'm not really quite sure what I give off. I did do the Sunrise Semester for CBS, you know, that NYU did many years ago. It actually was, not that I was on it, but all that time, but it was one of the longest running network programs in the history of television. I think only Captain Kangaroo and Lucy or Ed Sullivan were longer. And so I used to give these lectures, and then I would get letters from people. And all the letters were about what I gave off, except I got about 1,500 letters in a period of 4 months. Fewer than 50 had anything to do with the content of my remarks. They were all about what I gave off. And I did get letters from people who would tell me things that they wouldn't tell others. You know, I'd get a letter, I remember one in particular. Dear Dr. Postman, I'm a 72-year-old widow in an old person's home in Pittsburgh. My sainted husband died 6 years ago. But don't worry about it, Dr. Postman. He left me well fixed. My daughter lives in Montreal. My son lives in Los Angeles. I wish them the best, but you would think, Dr. Postman, that they send me a card or call me on my birthday. Well, that's the way life is sometimes. And, you know, it would go on. And so this was wondrous. You know, why is this woman telling me this thing? So I thought, well, maybe I was, look, what I gave off was that I'm sort of her son, or I'm a confidant. But other people, I gave off different things. I haven't been on television enough to know.
We'll find out. We're out of time, but we're going to find out what you give off. I want to ask you, do you have any other book in the works about television, follow on to this book?
Only the one before it, which was called The Disappearance of Childhood, was also about television and its impact on children. But the one coming out, which will be out this year in September, is a series of essays on technology, language, and education, and some of those are about television.
Dr. Neil Postman, author of Amusing Ourselves to Death, Public Discourse in the Age of Show Business, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.